reporting on
This meeting is being recorded.
on the NIST report 2025. I believe is that the right number? 2205. And this report detailed the spatial relationships between fuels, exposures, and hardening at the structure and the parcel level. So they were really trying to look at spacing and how that effect is distributed when a fire occurs of this sort. So Alex, I'm going to let you start. We have about an hour presentation, and we will be taking questions at the end. You can put them in the chat. You can raise your hand. And the only requirement we have is that you please mute yourself so that the presentation can be easily heard by everyone. So thank you, Alex, and welcome.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you for having us, and good morning, everyone. There's a lot of material I would like to cover with you today, so I'm going to start and jump right in. This is a collaborative effort that has taken almost a year and a half, and it has been a technical partnership between NIST, CAL FIRE, and IBHS, and I think that collaboration has had a lot of value because of the different perspectives that the different organizations bring to the table. So we set out this to create this methodology in large part to provide technical guidance to CAL FIRE and Cal OES for the AB 38 California Assembly bill on retrofit. But this has really significant implications, not only for retrofit, but also for construction. So the presentation outline here shows you how much we're going to go through. I'm not going to go through the presentation outline. It is in the PDF package that is being distributed, so you can go and review that at your convenience after the presentation. There are 5 key presentation themes that I want you to keep in mind throughout this presentation. So we're going to talk about structure separation distances and how we are using this concept to refine the WUI definitions at large, which are looking at the problem much more macroscopically at the national or even regional level. You're going to hear that fire and embers are very different, provide very different hazards, and how they're different spatially, temporally, and also what to do about them. You're going to hear specifically that we're going to require hardening for embers, and that the fuel spacing is going to drive how much hardening will be necessary for fire. Quick disclaimer, when we use the term required, this is within quotes. Really, we're talking about, throughout this presentation, when we say must or require or shall or should, this language is not code language. It is really to convey a point of critical technical importance that a specific action needs to be taken if we want to reduce ignition of structures and significant losses within the community. This methodology was specifically designed with an eye on cost effectiveness and efficiency. So you will see that it's very nuanced. You can think of it as a performance-based tool. There are a lot of different options. It is not one solution fits all. And I think that's going to make it much easier to implement. But there are, as you will see, a number of constraints in the context of partial hardening. You will hear what this buys and what it doesn't buy at the structure level and at a parcel level. And then the implementations of a partially hardening a structure or a parcel to the surrounding parcels and community. So you can see, you will already start getting a sense that all this is very tied together in space and time, and we need to look at this spatially at the resolution of interest. In this case, when we talk about parcels, we're talking commonly about residential parcels that can be, from an eighth of an acre to several acres. That's we're not talking about parcels of land of tens or hundreds of acres typically here. So these are themes that I want you to keep in mind throughout the presentation. So let's talk now about hardening and hazard mitigation specifically. So when we look at hazard mitigation, we cannot think of hazard mitigation in the absence of exposure. All right, it'd be like trying to build a building to resist a hurricane and not knowing what wind intensity you want to design the building to withstand. It's exactly the same thing with fire and embers. So when we're talking about hardening a structure, a parcel, a community, we have to think of the hardening knob and also think of the exposure knob. And what we want is we want to get in the sweet spot. We want to reduce the exposure and harden the structure and get to the point where the structure doesn't ignite. We don't want to over design, but that is obviously a safer approach. We certainly don't want to under design. All right. So it's really the balance between those dials. And we have to really understand this every time we talk about a mitigation, the parcel, and every time we talk about a mitigation at the structure, we have to be asking ourselves exactly what are we trying to defend against. All right. So you'll see this and you'll hear this theme throughout, because this is really the driver, the technical driver that stitches this whole methodology together, this understanding of the hardening and the exposure. So if we look at the WUI fire that Denise mentioned, the campfire that we're studying, and this is not only applicable to camp, it's applicable at large. We put this slide into the because we heard our campfire presentation. The primary drivers that WUI fire losses were and are fuel ignition potential. You can think of this as drought, density of vegetative and structural fuels, wind and terrain, and extent of fire front reaching the community. And for those of you who looked at the camp, know the impact of that relationship between ignition location and community and the spacing in between. But out of all those four, the only one we can control is density of vegetation and structural fuels. We cannot control the ignition potential, we cannot control the wind, we cannot control the terrain, and we cannot control when the ignition is going to occur with respect to the community. So this is the sweet spot. That's where we need to focus. And vegetative not only includes, of course, within the community, but also in the immediate surrounding for some distance out. Let's jump in and now talk about WUI definitions. And this is table 1 in the report. Throughout the presentation, on the lower left side of the slides, you will see either the table or the figure number so that you can easily go and find it in the report if you want to clarify and learn more about it. I'm not going to dive into all of the details of the federal definition, common implementation, and specifically in California, how CAL FIRE has chosen to apply some of these federal register definitions. What I do want to say, though, is that these definitions were intended to provide a snapshot country level across the US, and added significant value to help us understand where WUI is. There are significant limitations behind these definitions, and we'll talk about a couple of them right here. One is that it's quite coarse, and it's understandable that definitions are coarse because we are looking at landscape scales, using land fire data in many cases, coarse information. The second part is, by default, because we're defining it, we're constraining it, and what this does is it creates, in many cases, arbitrary lines where on one side of the street we are in WUI, and on the other side of the street we're not. And that can cause problems, an example of which is the losses at Coffey Park in Santa Rosa, where that community is almost a mile, 0.9 miles away from the furthest reach of the WUI definitions. So we like to think of, as we move forward, we want to start thinking about large outdoor fire risk areas, not necessarily just WUI, because we are seeing that these definitions can really restrict our implementation, our decision-making process. So we wanted to use this as a baseline, but really expand. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to introduce structure separation density, SSD, all right? And SSD is important for two reasons. First, it now allows us to focus in on a scale of interest to the fire propagation within the communities, but also helps us flag by binning into these different categories areas where the behavior will be noticeably and significantly different from other areas. So if you have very large structure separation distances, like in the type 6 and 7, if a structure ignites, it will not ignite the neighboring structure directly from fire, radiation, and convection. Embers will always be a problem, and we're going to be talking about that. But in low density, structure to structure is not a high. It doesn't really occur unless you have a very specific local situation. And as you see, as we go forward, this methodology really is not intended to be applied with a broad brush across a community. You have to do the analysis at the parcel and structure level. But if we go at the very top of this table, you see this 6 foot to 30 foot SSD range, and there we can clearly expect structure to structure fire spreads. So we wanted to introduce that concept, look at typical parcel size, and these are not in any absolutes. The SSDs, the binning of SSDs definitely provides a high-level perspective. When we look at a community, we can say, okay, we are in a type 1 or type 2 type of community, but that's not sufficient. As I said, we have to do the analysis at the structure and parcel level. And later on in the presentation, you're going to see why you cannot just use parcel size and why you cannot just use SSD. It's really the spatial layout at the parcel and within parcels that drives or should drive, in the case of HMM, our mitigation strategy. So this is an example of a type 2 WUI. And here we have, SSD structure separation distances, in type 2 between 6 and 30 feet. And if we look at Coffee Park here, this is post tubs, and this is pre. In this, sorry, I'm pointing to the wrong screen. Right here, this is post and this is pre. We see SSDs of 8 feet to 11 feet. And we know the extent of devastation that occurred there. And I mean, just for scale, this is 1 acre, and we're already see CH structures right there. So let's move along and look at some others. Coffee Park is by no means an outlier, and California is by no means an outlier. We're seeing this type of structure separation density, i.e. high density construction all across the nation. This is an example from our Waldo fire reconstruction in Colorado Springs. This is the Majestic neighborhood. And here you see these lots are nominally at just a fraction under a tenth of an acre. The red indicates destruction, so very similar behavior as what we saw in Coffee Park. And if we look at it a little bit more, again, here in less than an acre, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's even a little denser than what we just showed for Coffee. If you look at the water report, you can see the different structure separation distances and understand a little bit more about fire behavior in those different spacing regimes. But the sea of destruction here really tells us of the potential for very high losses in high density. Now, having said that, little spoiler alert here, you will see as we go forward that there is a path forward. There is a path forward to really enhance the resiliency of those communities, and that's really one of the significant value added values added by HMM. So let's keep going here just to get to keep getting our bearings. This is a type 6. This is in Rancho Santa Fe, near San Diego. And here you see, significantly more room between structures. In some cases, the structures are closer. We'll see this slide as well. So again, when we talk about a type of community, it's to provide perspective. The analysis has to be done at the structure level. And this is a clear example. This is the Trails community in Rancho Bernardo. This is from our Witch and Gehita fire reconstruction. And here we have two communities, or two community types. Type 6 right here, and then type 5 on this side of the street with much closer structure separation distances. And you could argue that even this right here could be interpreted as type 5 compared to the spacings. Here, a few things to point out. When you look at these parcels, we're seeing irrigated lawns, extensive irrigated lawns, long paved driveways, i.e. non-combustible, pools, tennis courts. So this situation, there are a few areas with fuel, but I'm going to use the term loosely here, landscape. Parcels are very well maintained, irrigated, trimmed, pruned, cleaned. And there's a little bit of a section over here that is more of a wild habitat, and that extends in the ravine on the other side towards the valley. So we have to keep focusing at the parcel level and understanding what we're really seeing, understanding what the structure is going to see in terms of exposures, where these exposures are going to come from. Lastly, I want to show a type 7. So this is low density intermix. This is Concow, and this is the zoomed in area over here. So you can see really the very low density. This imagery is taken post campfire in both cases. All right. So here those structures are quite a ways apart. And there was significant vegetation, and we can see the destruction here. All right, so let's now dive in and talk about fire and ember exposures. So we mentioned this earlier. It's a balance. So let's understand a little bit more about the exposure. So we're going to look at the red knob and see how we can take it apart and look at fire and look at embers separately, because we have to address them separately. They're not the same thing at all. So I'm going to start at the bottom here of the slide. So we have a source here, and the source is generating fire and embers. Depending on the source, fire can be a problem intra or interparcel, depending on the intensity of the source, the location of the source within the parcel, and the sizes of the parcel. But to bound the problem, fire is an issue we need to deal with anywhere from 0, meaning the fuel that is burning is right against the target, the residence we want to protect, nominally up to 100 feet. This is a hard, upper end is a hard, but it provides context. And in many cases within the community, we're talking about tens of feet of exposure that we have to deal with. These fluxes can be over 100 kilowatts per meter square if you get in the flames. Durations, you can have a bush that flares up that lasts a few seconds, or you can have a structure that is burning that can burn for tens of minutes. So the exposure is quite variable. In terms of critical ignition heat flux, we can think about 15 kilowatts per meter square. This is a rough number. Of course, it is a function of the flux, the duration integrated with respect to what the residence or the particular material in the assembly can withstand. But at least this starts bounding the problem. And the point here is 100 way greater than 15. If you have flame heating, in most cases, we're going to end up losses. Any significant exposures will result in losses. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward in a little bit more detail. The embers are challenging in a different way. There is an even larger variability because not only we have the generation that can impact the size and the energy content, the wind will help drive how far they go, but then we have local accumulation issues that can enhance the ignition potential. So whereas one ember may not ignite, if it's a small ember, many embers together accumulated in a corner may cause an ignition. So the point with the embers is that they can travel literally miles, certainly a quarter mile, half a mile. Typically we end up in high exposures. If you have any significant sources, they can vary from sub 1 inch to multiple inches. The challenge here is that during these catastrophic WUI events, local ember exposures can literally be in the millions of embers. So you cannot, no, I shouldn't say you cannot. It's not advisable to play the odds. And the bottom line is, when you have those very high exposures, they will find those vulnerabilities. So we cannot just pick and choose and say, oh, I'm just going to do a couple of things for the embers and the others I'm not going to worry about. That's unfortunately not how it works, because in high exposures, we literally, the parcel and the structures get inundated, flooded with, they are within a sea of embers, literally, and that causes, that makes exposure vulnerabilities, ignition vulnerabilities really pop. And you cannot predict if you're going to be realistically in high exposure situation, because there are so many variables in how these events unfold. Has a lot to do with the low fuels, the weather, and the defensive action. So you cannot count on low exposures, unfortunately, with respect to embers,
Alex,
because they can travel so far.
Alex, can I just interrupt you for a second? I apologize. Can you maybe turn off your video, because your internet is you're kind of cutting in and out. So maybe if you turn off your video, that might help. Perfect.
I just stopped the camera. Let's see if this is any better. How is this? Can you hear me okay?
So far, yes.
Seems to be better
Okay,
now.
all right.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Denise. So do I need to go back, or you guys caught most of it so far?
I think we're okay, Alex.
All right, okay. So this is a scenario here where the fire comes, in this case, from the wildlands, the bottom of the screen, and the community gets initially impacted by embers. There's a little animation to show how things tie together and how the fire starts progressing within the community. So the embers come in, the front arrives, and once you have a structure ignition, now locally you have significantly higher fire exposures and a new source term for ember generations. You can think of it as dominoes falling, and we really want to manage those ignitions. Ideally stop them, but the impact of those ignitions is going to really be a function of the community density and the structure separation density. So as you see going forward, one structure ignition in high density does not have the same impact on the community as one ignition in a community that has 2-acre lots. So let's look at structure ignition pathways here, because at the end of the day, this is really what's causing the ignition. So here we have a list of, just as an example, 5 different vulnerabilities. There are many, as you know, and as we'll see in the tables that follow. And here we have fuels within the community, so on the same parcel and surrounding parcels, and here the wildland fuels. In white are materials that we have already done some research. An example, fences, we have conducted experiments, I think, with 150 or more fences. Yeah, I think we've done 50 nominally, plus fence experiments. We have done experiments with wood piles, railroad ties, mulches, some ornamental vegetation, and we are almost done with our sheds work. That work should be completed this summer, and we should be releasing 2 shed reports this year. But the point is, all of these can bring fire to the building, and they can bring embers to the building. So I want to look at a specific situation. As I mentioned earlier, the flames, the fire, and when we talk fire, it's convection and radiation, are really driven by the spacing. The embers are going to go places. Exactly how far they go is very variable. We can have no control of that, so we're not going to focus on any of that in HMM. So let's look at a specific scenario, and this is from the camp. We have multiple fire ignition pathways that you can study at in this technical note 2135, the campfire fire progression timeline report 2135. Here we have a fence to ornamental vegetation to residence, and this is the progression: combustible fence, tree, eaves, structure destroyed. The point that just one point I want to make here, and you will see this in an example in a few slides. This residence, so the owner here, had placed a chain link fence on their property, probably 5 to 6 feet away from their residence. So they had done what they could do. It's unclear where this tree belongs, if it belongs on this property, on that property. But the point is, these pathways really bring fire to the house, to the residence, or to the structure of interest, and we need to uncouple them. And we have to think of the exposure and the hardening to make sure we get to the uncoupling. And the other point, Meg, is just from this snapshot in time, you can see the ember generation occurring, getting going over here. And we have reports, and there are plenty of reports out there, literally of millions of embers moving through community. This is not new. We need to deal with both of those things. So let's go to fire pathways and expand now and look at structure and parcels. And there are 3 different scenarios that I want us, that I want us to look at. So number 1 is that codes are typically parcel centric, and there is very little information that relates the hazards from parcel to parcel. There is some information on primary residences, and very limited information on auxiliary structures. And this has significant negative impacts on the problem at hand here. So we need to acknowledge it, understand it, and then leverage it to improve our community resilience. Number 2, linear features can carry fire very effectively within and between parcels, and you're going to see a number of scenarios. And fuel agglomeration has significant impact on the energy release. We use the term agglomeration specifically and intentionally. This is a new term in the context of WUI. We are not thinking of fuel loading the way we use fuel loading as an average across, let's say, a commercial structure. If you look at a commercial building and an office and you say, okay, my fuel loading is so many pounds per square foot. That's not the point. Here, the concern is as we take those fuels and pull them together, we are having issues. So we're going to go through all 3 now and look at them in more detail. So let's look first at the code issue. So in lot number 1, we have 1 lot, 2 residences, and 1 auxiliary structure. So let's look at the shed. One of is need to have appropriate setbacks. Let's say that in this case, the shed is 120 square feet, so it is regulated at the state level in California. And we need to have structure separation distances that meet the state code and potentially more restrictive local codes, but to both structures, to both residences. However, if we take this same residential spacing and layout, but now split the lot in two, what we see is the effect of the parcel-centric code approach to fuel placement. And we are okay here because we need to maintain that 30 feet or 30 foot or whatever the requirement for that specific shed is. But when you go in the other direction here, now we're only restricted by a 5-foot setback. And if the residence also has a 5-foot setback, now we're looking at 10 feet. If the residence is sprinklered, that could now bring that to 5 + 3, as little as 8 feet. So we have 8 feet in this direction, 30 feet in this direction. We have a problem. So existing codes are parcel centric, and we need to be very mindful of that and accepting that and leveraging that as we move forward through a combination of tools, whether it is changing state, local ordinances, leveraging this at the HOA level. There are multiple implementation pathways for these types of knowledge, including HMM at large. So linear features. So here, this is a made-up scenario, but it's made up of actual real-world situations, a combination of field data collected information, field data, and data from our observations that we then confirmed during our experiments. So if we look at an ignition B here, the ignition B can carry fire. One single ignition can carry fire to 6 lots and can ignite 3 structures. So these linear features, and we're seeing it, have significant impact on this community. So this figure is figured in the report. You can go and look at it. And the point to make here next is, even if we remove the shed to residence connections, which is one of the requirements in some jurisdictions, what we're going to have is another pathway through the shed. And this is a picture of our indoor shed to structure experiments. The report of that should be coming out in the next 4 to 6 weeks. And then once this gets going, then it'll propagate here. And this is our NIST technical note 1600, where we set 2 structures apart 6 feet. And then we didn't ignite the full house on the right. We just ignited the living room. The fire came out the window. And then within 80 seconds, 80, the neighboring structure was on fire. So you can appreciate the complexities and challenges of these linear features, particularly because they're connected. They're connected between parcels, and they're acting truly as wicks, carrying fire throughout the communities. And we have seen this across the nation. We've seen it all the way back to the witch. We've seen it in Texas with the Amarillo and the Tanglewood complex fire. We saw it in Waldo, and we saw it in Camp as well. So this is a really big issue. We have to be very mindful of that, particularly in high density communities. So let's talk about fuel agglomeration, and then we're going to look at a couple of things here. So this is from the fence report that's going to be coming out. So this is what a single fence looks like. This is what a double fence looks like. And there are a lot of double fences out there. So you put up a fence and your neighbor doesn't like your fence, they put up another fence. And now this fuel agglomeration disproportionately increased the energy release, therefore the exposure. So this has, again, a very significant impact at the parcel level. And you read the report that, we spaced those fences by 2+ feet, and we're still seeing effects. So this type of local fuel agglomeration really has very, very dangerous, potentially dangerous repercussions throughout the community. So let's look at now spatial relationships between fuels and two adjacent parcels. Okay, so we have, let's just go through lot A and lot B real quick. We have two residences, they each have a deck. This structure, this parcel, lot A, there are two sheds, A1 and A2. On lot B, we have a smaller shed similar to A2, and then we have a gazebo. So if we do our, spatial analysis here, we see that
some privacy, and we saw some regulations enacted by Europe.
Somebody's talking. If they could mute, thank you. This shed is appropriately spaced from this residence, and this shed is appropriately spaced from this residence. However, we have a number of issues. This gazebo is close to the combustible fence, same with this shed on this side. And then we have this issue of fuel agglomeration. And what happens is shed 1 from lot A in this figure is too close to residence B. So that's a problem. But also we have this significant agglomeration between those two sheds and the parallel fence here. And then this substantially increases the exposures, which then impacts residence B. And this is an illustration of the challenges of the spatial location and interactions, not only within a parcel, but across parcels. And then that all is go do analysis, find out where you're going to put your fuels, and in some cases where you cannot have fuels because of limited space. So let's look at now another fuel agglomeration issue combined with linear features. So here we have taken the fences away from residence A, which is something that we encourage people to do, but let's see if this is sufficient. Also on lot B, residence B has chosen to put a non-combustible fence, a chain link fence. So initially, this looks pretty sparse. You think that we're okay. Well, let's see how this plays out. Things are good here, and the gazebo is good. Gazebo to non-combustible fence is good. But if we look at the gazebo to the fence, that now can bring fire straight to residence A. And these are the types of pathways and behaviors that we're seeing over and over out there. So gazebo to neighboring fence to RV to structure. This is a snapshot from an digitized snapshot from an actual community. And you can see, we haven't put mulch beds on this. We haven't put a lot of the fuels, of the smaller fuel present. But you can see that the scenarios that we illustrated in the previous slides are very real, and in many cases don't even capture the challenges of very high density as illustrated by this figure, where SSDs are as little as 8 feet in this figure. So now let's look at structure hardening. Let's dive in and specifically look at what we need to do. So embers are uncontrollable. We talked about that. Unpredictable. They can come from your neighboring lot or 2 lots down. We really, with the exception of managing the ignition, the fuel loading and the ignition of fuels within our parcels, we have very little control of embers. And in reality, managing the fuels at our parcel really should be done primarily for fire, because that has the local impact. The embers, even if you manage yours, you could literally get a sea of embers from your neighboring parcel. So we cannot assume that we're going to have low exposures. We have to assume we're going to have high exposures. We have identified 40 separate vulnerabilities, and if you identify more, please expand and add them to the use of HMM. The bottom line is we need to plan to harden for embers, and we have to assume we're going to have high exposures, which means we have to deal with all the Ember vulnerabilities. We cannot pick and choose. Let's talk about fire, hardening for fire. So right off the bat, I want to say hardening the building is the last resort, okay? Reduce, relocate, remove. Those are the 3 R's of hardening before we get to the structure. So reduce fuels, let's give us an example, firewood pile. Well, have less firewood on your property, that's going to mean less energy release when it catches, and that'll help with fire or flame exposures. Relocate, we've been talking to folks about moving their firewood pile away, but as we saw in previous slides, and as we'll see again, there are limitations, because you don't want to think this as a parcel-centric approach. This is a parcel analysis, but based on exposures which come from other parcels. So it's a community approach. Remove the fuel. This is by far the best solution. When you have gone through the 3 R's, only then we should consider hardening. And hardening is done in HMM directionally. So you want to deal with where the exposures are, and it's only implementable, I shouldn't say implementable, it's only recommended in specific scenarios where it'll add value. And there are many scenarios where it will not add value, and we are saying don't expend valuable resources hardening in a situation where the exposure is so high you will not be able to really add significant value. So hardening, we need to deal with understanding the relationship, but before we go and start changing the cladding of buildings, reduce, relocate, remove. So that's why these things are grouped in the way they are. So this is a very dense slide, and I encourage you to go and study it. But the main point I want to make here, is that structure separation distance and the way we have redefined WUI, including structure separation distance, has significant implications on how the community is going to respond to a single structure ignition. So if we look at potential fire exposure from burning neighboring structure, this is high. Probability of structure survivability if neighboring structure ignites, low. All right. Impact of structure ignition on fire spread in community, high. Likely effectiveness of partial structure/parcel hardening, low. And what this means in a nutshell is, in high density, we have to keep fire out. We cannot keep embers out, but we really have to keep fire out. We have to harden for embers, and we have to keep fire out, because once that fire gets started, it's very hard to manage. Because of the density of the fuel agglomeration, it becomes, in cases where we have, and this is not a hard number, but for perspective, winds of 12 to 15 miles an hour and above, we can physically not abstract. We cannot remove the energy fast enough to prevent that spread. And we see this because we see non-WUI events where a structure ignites in a community, and by the time it's contained, several structures have been lost. So it is very, very, very critical to really internalize this and think that high density is a very different animal. The good news is we know how to do it. And the challenge is that it is very restrictive. But you have to, the way I look at it is, we cannot maintain our same lifestyles and build the same way and have everything the same and expect not to have the losses. So we're going to need some changes. HMM is enabling us to look at the spatial densities and leverage them, and look at the hardening, and then make decisions. Because as we'll see, there's a very big difference between making a structure defensible and making a structure stand alone. So in high density, we have to really make sure that we don't have structure ignitions, because the consequences of such ignitions are very, unfortunately, dire. So if we look at implementing HMM, we're moving right along here. We have, we're going to harden for embers always, and we cannot pick and choose, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail here. And then we're going to look at the tables B, C, and D to look at the flames and hardening for fire. And that's going to be a function of fuels, a source term, energy release size, and spacing. So we're going to work from outside in, surrounding parcels, then primary parcel, then tables B and C tell us when we need to go to D and harden and what needs to be hardened in D for fire hardening at the structure level. So let me move here. So table A, this is a snapshot. I'm not going to go through, obviously, all of this. It's in the report. You can study it. And we spend hundreds of hours on these tables here. So we have structure, component assembly, or attached combustible. As an example, here is the skylight. So this is Ember hardening. The hardening action, what's needed, the performance goal, applicable conditions. So, not only that helps for identifying where the weaknesses are, but also that can be used for grants and things like that. Any specific notes, expected cost, it's relative, $1, $2, $3, and existing code. And we'll talk about codes towards the end of the presentation, but just as a snapshot here, you can see this is not in the code, 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 and so on and so forth. So good news is we have paths forward. And when we say not in the code, we're talking about, in this case, Chapter 7A, WUI code in 1140. We haven't done this type of analysis for local jurisdictions and that type of resolution. So for Embers, we have identified 40 vulnerabilities. As I said earlier, if we want, I shouldn't say we worked to try and be all inclusive, but if you find one that you have, please, please let us know. And HMM is a living document. So as additional information becomes available from the science, and we need from science, when appropriate, we will refine some of those spacings. But because we spend so much time in doing experiments and field data collection, we feel that we have those numbers bound pretty well. But when and if things need to be refined, there will be so. So if you find something that we've missed in terms of Ember vulnerability, please let us know, or just apply it locally. There are multiple options because in some cases there is more than one solution. For instance, right here, you can see the options. There are 8 major categories for the Embers. The key point is all of it has to be dealt with. One quick asterisk here, one quick note before we move on to tables B, C, and D. There are, with respect to Embers, if you have a large surface area, like combustible cladding with a lot of nooks and crannies, or a combustible old roof, again, that has a lot of Ember catching potential, those large surface area exposures / vulnerability, I shouldn't say exposures, vulnerabilities, can act as big targets for the Ember. So removing those definitely adds significant value, but just doing that and not doing the others is not, you're playing the odds, and it's not going to result in a reduction, a significant reduction in losses. So bottom line for Embers, we cannot cut corners. We have to deal with all vulnerabilities, because when you're literally in a sea of Embers with millions of Embers hitting that structure, they're going to find those weak spots. All right, let's move on to table B. So here we're looking at surrounding parcels. So, and the point is we want to look at, I'm going to call them far field, but it's a relative term. far field in the context of an 8-acre parcel, but all of this could be your parcel, because if you have a large parcel of 2-3 acres, all of these exposures could be potentially within your preview. But the point is, we have to look far out and see what is coming. So we need to look at proximity to closest residence, and we have some considerations for slope, hardening actions. So this is the structure separation distance or neighboring parcel exposure distance that we're looking at here for the different types of fuels. There are some notes in the table, and we have a couple of concepts. We have minimum required fuel separation distance. Okay, so you want these fuels to be at least this far out. And then you have a concept of fuel separation range. And the idea behind the range is that there's a sweet spot. If the fuel is too close, hardening is not going to do much. If your fuel is too far, the hazard from flames will not be there. And we'll see a couple of examples illustrated in a few slides on how this plays out. And when you're in the sweet spot, the methodology here points you to table D for the directional hardening of your structure. So this is a table B where we look at far field, let's call them exposures. Table C, now we're looking at, primary parcel. So here you look at your firewood, your vegetative fuels, your different auxiliary structures. It's a function of size, other structures, vehicles like RVs, boats, things like that, fences, and other small combustibles. Same idea, lots of notes and requirements. When you don't meet the minimum fuel separation distance, it sends you over to table D. And this is table D, where directionally you have to deal with all of these to manage the fire exposure. But as we said earlier, I want to stress that we want to go through the 3 R's first: reduce, remove, relocate, before we go into table D. So let's look at this notion of, I'm going to go back here one slide and one more. Oops, sorry. It's a little apology for the jumping around, but let's go and my mouse is misbehaving. How am I going to do it again? Let's go and look at this fuel separation range. Let's say 25 to 50 right here, and see how it plays out. So this is now figure 15 in the report. We have flipped the figure around. So we're going to start with scenario 3 and work our way to scenario 1 for clarity. So here we have a situation where we have an auxiliary structure very close to the residence. So we can move this structure some distance away to meet the requirements in tables B and C. And in this case, we are in the what we'll call the sweet spot, where the exposures are not going to be as severe as in scenario 1, but there are still concerns about exposure. And in this case, the path forward here is to directionally harden these 2 sides of the building. But remember the 3 R's. So we also, before we jump into this, we want to explore what other relocation options we have. So if we move this, we have the room on the parcel, and we move this far enough, now we're okay. However, big however, remember that this is a community approach. So we don't want to take our hazards and move them away from our residents and cause problems for the neighbors. And this is exactly the situation we would have here. So fuel relocation must consider neighboring parcels. And this is, we saw this idea earlier in the presentation. So reduce, relocate, remove, then harden, but look at it not only in the context of your own parcel or the parcel being assessed, but also the surrounding parcels as well. So this is now, we went through this exercise with the shed, which is movable. Now let's look at the fuel spacing between residences, which are fixed for existing construction. So in a scenario A here, in scenario to the left, we have distance greater than 50 feet. So we're not concerned about one residence having direct fire, specifically fire. Remember, we have hardened for embers. Direct fire impact on this. So residence A would not directly impact residence B, and the same vice versa. When we are in the situation where we talk about 25 to 50 feet, now we are concerned, but we can harden. And this is a scenario where the hardening in many cases will add significant value. And remember, we wanted to do this, we wanted to provide an implementable path forward. So this range is based on field observations and experiments, and additional experiments are happening as part of a multi-agency collaboration with CAL FIRE and IBHS and CBIA and US Fire Administration and WUI Code, where we're going to be looking at auxiliary dwelling units and then ultimately some single residence experiments to better understand this range. But here we're looking at a spacing of 25 to 50. This is a contemporary harden. Over here, when you're less than 25, there is very limited value in hardening. And you can take, in order to understand this, you can take this to the extreme. If you're 6 feet away, when your neighbor catches on fire, whether you have Chapter 7A compliant cladding or not, it is very difficult to prevent the neighboring structure from catching on fire. So this is a way to keep costs down and add value where value can be added based on the spatial attributes between lots. So I want to move ahead here. I'm going to go through this section pretty quickly. We have 4 scenarios I want to look at. And here we have different lot sizes. As we talked at the beginning, we added structure separation distances in the WUI definitions. But really, you want to look at this at the parcel level and do the analysis there. So we have scenario here. We have type 2 WUI. So if you look, SSD 10 feet. We have a shed here. This shed is appropriately spaced with respect to this structure, but not with respect to the neighbor. We're not even talking about the potential fuel agglomeration if this is a combustible fence. So in small lots, it's very difficult to add extra fuel and not cause problems. Unfortunately, that's the reality because of the different pathways. If we look at WUI Type 4, this is definitely, we're looking at larger lots. So here there are a couple of areas where fuels would be problematic because of the spacing, because of the locations. But there is an area here far enough from these structures where auxiliary fuels could be placed with limited impact on these buildings. On the bottom here, what we see is this is in Paradise. So this was impacted by the campfire. On the left here, we see pre-camp imagery, which is what happened here, or what is depicted above. And on the right is post-fire. And this is the fire scenario. This shed right here ignited. This is all from first responder observations. We spent 6 months in the field collecting data and talking with first responders and other people that were involved in the camp to pull all this together. This shed ignites, it ignites this fence ignites the neighboring shed ignites and destroys this building, and in the process injures a firefighter. As the lots get bigger, more options are available. This is another nice example of WUI Type 4. These are large lots, but locally we have a lot of fuels pushed towards the road, and you see structure separation distances that could require some hardening. But there are places on these lots, and this is a great example of a shed here, where fuels can be placed with limited impact on the primary structures. And then one more over here. And then we'll move to a structure survivability section and summarize. So here, this is Rancho Bernardo, impacted by the Witch and Gejito fires at the Trails community. And these are large structures, pardon me, on large lots, and there are areas where we can put fuels. But we have to be mindful, again, within those areas to limit fuel agglomeration and to really lay this out so we don't end up in a situation where we create either a dangerous pathway or locally very high exposures. So let's talk about structure survivability. We're going to talk about defensive actions, the effect of partial structure hardening, partial community hardening, and structure density before we wrap it up. So defensive actions have a very significant effect on, I apologize for my mouse, it's a little finicky this morning. Defensive actions have significant effect on structural survivability in WUI fires. We have documented this all the way back to the Witch into Tanglewood and Waldo. And on average, over 90% of the time, we can tell you the name of the firefighter that saved the damaged structure. So if it is damaged, more than likely, it is defended. I would say if it's damaged, it's defended. But we don't stop there. In Waldo, we showed that 39% of undamaged structures within the fire perimeter were defended. So this has very significant implications because what it really means are two things. First, post-fire, we are seeing the effect of defensive actions on structure survivability. So first responders save structures, many structures, which is wonderful. And they're very effective and efficient in doing so. The second part is that because in many cases, their actions are not obvious, quick drive-by studies of WUI disasters can very easily misinterpret the survivability of a structure and draw wrong conclusions on the effectiveness of a building's attributes when in fact the sole reason the building was standing could be because it was defended. So this is a cautionary note. Defensive actions add extreme value in the positive, but don't just go and look at what's standing and say, oh, you know, this house, the eaves were open and it's standing. Oh, the eaves are not a problem. You cannot do that. Absolutely, you know, technically you cannot do that. So be very mindful about that. But let's now understand acknowledge defensive actions matter and move forward and see how we can use this information. So what happens? Defensive actions matter, but again, I'm really sorry. We have more large fires that occur like the Tubbs and Camp. And we've also experienced in California and in the West, multiple firestorms. So what this means is if you take those two bullets together, we end up in many situations where the number of exposed structures quickly outnumber statewide resources. So we cannot count on first responders to defend the buildings. So there is a very big difference between utilizing defensible space and using that as the anchor for our codes and standards and saying, we want to make a structure / parcel defensible, and that's an approach, versus we cannot count on first responders, so we have to make a home standalone. And we feel that based on the size of the events and the frequency of firestorms, we should aim for making structures standalone. And that is a significant paradigm shift with how we've been thinking about the parcel hardening and the structure hardening. So let's look at partial structure hardening. So I'm going to read this slide because it's very nuanced, and I want to make sure that it is captured directly. The effectiveness of partial hardening represents how much benefit is provided by fractional structure hardening. All right. Next, partial hardening of structures has a reduced impact on structure survivability that is not directly proportional to the fraction of hardening actions implemented. So hardening for 50% of embers does not give you 50% in ignition resistance. And hardening for 50% of fire does not give you 50% protection. It does not work, unfortunately, like that at all. Particularly when you look at the building as a standalone and acknowledge that you cannot count on first responders being there, which is the exact opposite of the way we've been thinking and dealing with fire problem inside buildings, right? The first responders are part of our strategy, and residents in most places know that if there is a fire, they'll pick up the phone, they'll dial 911, and there'll be an engine, and the engine will deal with the problem. This doesn't work like that in WUI events or in large outdoor fire events. So we don't have the option to choose to partially harden and expect significant reduction in ignitions and losses. So we put the statement together. I'm going to go through it and show you the different components. Effectiveness of partial hardening is inversely proportional to local fire. So that is the flames, radiation, convection, ember exposures, incident size, and number of simultaneous incidents. So these two in the bottom really tie to the availability of defensive actions. And we just talked about that. Fire, there are two parts. What may come from the outside of our parcel, which we may not be able to control. Typically, we don't have control, but hopefully if the HMM is implemented at community level, then that's managed that way. But the resident has significant control on exposures within the parcel. And I think that there is a lot to be said about this. And we're talking about reduction, relocation, removal, and ultimately hardening. As we'll see in the next section here in a couple of slides, dealing with this at the parcel level can be an approach in low density and to some degree in moderate density, but in high density, we have to look at the community as a whole. We already talked about embers. We have no control over them, so we must harden. So if we look at partial community hardening, one structure ignition in high density, large losses. In moderate density, it's going to really vary on the local specifics between fuels at the parcel and within parcels. Low density, I think there we're going to, the losses are going to be driven by the embers and ember hardening to a large extent, but you can clearly see the relationships. So the message here is, if we want to aim for partial hardening, we need to space things further apart to compensate for those ignitions. So high structure density, we say resident participation in complete structure and parcel hardening is required. Again, we're not saying this from an AHJ perspective, but from a technical science perspective, we need to deal with these communities in an integrated way. Otherwise, an ad hoc patchwork approach will, in many cases, just waste resources, unfortunately. Moderate density, variable losses, and low density, we call this desired, because here, if you're talking about structures that are on, 2 acres, there's a lot of flexibility. And, if some residents don't want to do hardening and they're willing to risk losing their homes, the impacts on that community are not going to be the same. So in that sense, there is more flexibility as the SSD increases. So lastly, let's talk about codes. And unfortunately, there is a lot missing in the codes. I do want to caution you that when we did the analysis, we really were looking for exact, for the code to have the specific hardening attribute in the exact way that is detailed in HMM, because it is so specific, because the fire behavior is so nuanced and the hardening is so detail specific. So the table here does not mean, should not be used to imply that when we say none, that the code doesn't have anything in those areas. In most cases it doesn't, but there are a few areas where the code has some partial wording, and with some tweaks could be brought up to speed to match the HMM wording. But unfortunately, we think of these codes right now, and this is a generalized statement, and it does not reflect bad in any way on any of the organizations involved. In many cases, the thought behind the codes was to make the structures defensible, and that is a conscious decision that AHJs and at the state level, the Office of the State Fire Marshal can make. We're saying, hey, if you want the community to stand alone, the bar now has to be way higher, and HMM gives you a path forward. So let's summarize. We looked at a lot of different parts here. I'm not going to go through all of them. Just a few highlights. A parcel-centric approach as vulnerabilities for fire spread pathways, fuel agglomeration problematic, fuel loadings can be an issue in actual WUI settings. We looked at how to implement the methodology with tables A, B, C, and D. We looked at different parcel layouts, effects of defensive actions, and the partial hardening at the structure level and at the community level. HMM was developed based on literally tens of thousands of hours of work in the field. Our 4 case studies to date. In order to do those, the NIST team, we have literally spent 2 years in the field observing post-fire, the post-fire scene, and talking with hundreds and hundreds of first responders. The good news is that we have a path forward. HMM is designed to leverage the spatial components of exposures in a cost-effective way to deal with existing high-density constructions is a heavy lift. We acknowledge that. The bar is set very high. The good news is we have a path forward. Lastly, we showed why, in many cases, we don't want to be partially implementing HMM. As I just mentioned, looking at existing codes, and the information is in the report. The codes are not quite as bad as the summary table, but unfortunately, a lot is not there. So we feel strongly that where HMM is implemented, if it is implemented as it is designed, we're going to significantly reduce losses. It is a challenge for existing high density communities, but it is a path forward. So we don't have to write these things off and think that Coffee Park will happen again and again, no matter where, all around the nation. So with that, right at 1 hour and 15 minutes, I want to thank you, and we'll take some questions.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Alex. That's a lot of information, and I'm going to let Eric track the most relevant questions to your presentation. And while he tracks that, I'll just ask a few of my own. Some questions here. Is NIST considering creating, you're doing all this field collection, all this data collection, and you're narrowing it down to, the top 10, 12 things that lead houses to being so vulnerable. Are you considering creating a very specific list that could be distributed to building departments, the state? And when I say a specific list, I mean, like you must have tempered windows. You cannot have wood fences between buildings that are less than 50 feet apart. Things like that are super specific that they can implement into a code.
That is a great question, Denise. So let me answer it in two ways. And again, I'm going to use HMM as the foundation for the answer, because the HMM was specifically designed, was specifically designed to answer your question. So the list has two components. The list has the fire component and the Ember component. We cannot go partial on the Ember. So the list of 40 vulnerabilities is what it is, and that is standalone. These things need to be addressed, period. With respect to fire, there are definitely a number of bad scenarios that pop up when you try to use HMM. So if we look at the approach of reduce, remove, relocate, and harden, there are trade-offs that can be made. So the method enables people to make some decisions. Now, having said that, let me say, so the answer to your question is a partial yes. For Embers, we have the list. For combustibles, let's call them parcel level combustibles, we don't have a direct list because it is so scenario specific. Having said that, and hearing what you're saying, I will say the following. We are working with Eric right now on creating a poster that will accompany HMM, the document, the report, that can be distributed to communities, put up at fire stations and town halls, etc. And we're going to have their examples, illustrations of 3 communities: high density, moderate density, and low density. And we're going to have the example of a community with the dangers and an example of a community with HMM, with the same community with HMM applied. And out of that will come a list of the vulnerabilities and how they were addressed. So that can be used to hone in on the list, but it is very scenario specific. And let me give you an example. The method, as we said, allows us to do a performance-based approach. But what we don't want is we don't want to restrict it in one way and create or allow or permit other fire spread pathways. So, and I'll give, we showed the example with the gazebo catching the fence, which then caught the RV, which caught the house. So there are so many different pathways that, to me, the fundamental issue is, to summarize it, in very small parcels, there is no place to put auxiliary fuels. That's, in a nutshell, the bottom line. Because when you're in and to me, that's really the game changer. When you're in high density, you cannot afford to have a single structure ignition. So we have to be very strict with preventing any of those fuels at the parcel level from catching a structure on fire. So another way to say it is, in very, very small lots, you won't have room to put pretty much anything. If you have a postage stamp lot, there's no place to put your shed, because if you push it far enough from your house, it's going to be next to your neighbor's house, and there's no other place to do it. So I think there's going to be a very to implement this effectively. We're going to end up with communities with significantly lower fuel loading, particularly in high density, to prevent those fuels from causing direct ignitions. So there's not a simple list. We could create a number of scenarios, but I think I'm hesitant to just take those, because as you saw, I hope you saw, HMM is very spatial, and we have to do the analysis. So there is no, can we say that parallel fences are very hazardous? Absolutely. But if you end up in a situation where you have a parallel fence and you have very large lots, that parallel fence away from the residences does not have to be replaced necessarily. So, the whole purpose here was to make it very cost effective. So it does take time to do the analysis. I will say, I'll mention this, and I don't think that Chief Hawks is going to object. CAL FIRE has created a tool for inspectors to do the analysis at the parcel level. So because CAL FIRE and Cal OES are now piloting HMM in 3 communities in California. So the tool is out there, and I'm sure it can be, I shouldn't say I'm sure, I would not be surprised if it can be distributed, so that we can get communities to put HMM through their paces, and it'll become very apparent what fuel loadings can be tolerated and how many things cannot be on those very, very small lots. Does that help, Denise?
Yeah, that's great. Well, and I also want to say is that, 7A will likely become much more stringent.
Yes,
and even
absolutely.
houses that are 7A compliant now, so newer houses, it's my belief, and I think you probably saw this too, is that after the house is constructed and signed off from the building and planning department, homeowners add auxiliary items such as vegetation screening,
Yes.
wood fences, sheds.
Yep.
And so even though the house was 7A compliant, it's the homeowners who effectively have created their own destruction by adding these auxiliary items. And
Absolutely.
these auxiliary items a lot of times are not required to be enforced
Regulate.
by a code. So
Yes.
it's kind of this endless cycle. I have one.
Denise,
Yeah.
But you bring a very, very good point. First of all, you have to look at, when we look at this from a code perspective, we have to look at it as a system. So it's Chapter 7A and Chapter 49 that deals and all the defensible space. But your point is right on. We have to look at the exposures, and what the homeowners put on the parcel has unfortunately very significant implications for their structure and the community at large. So from our perspective, it doesn't matter. I mean, from an implementation perspective, it matters. But if you look at this from 30,000 feet, it doesn't matter where the regulation comes from as long as it gets done, whether Chapter 7A gets more restrictive or Chapter 7A has a baseline and then the local jurisdiction raise the bar to HMM, or the local jurisdictions go halfway and HOAs raise the bar the rest of the way. As long as we deal with all of this, we can use different tools to get there, but we have to deal with all of it, because I can tell you that, for every regulated shed over 120 square feet, there are, I don't know what the number is, but 30, 40, 50 small unregulated, and many of them will burn homes down. So we need to deal with these fuels in a way that is implementable and manageable for the long haul, because it's a challenge. I mean, we know how to do it, but it is a challenge.
Well, yeah, we just need to change the code drastically and then have significant enforcement. So before I let Eric start with the questions, I also want to just mention your table regarding the damaged homes that were obviously defended by firefighters. You have firefighters who are likely, selecting these properties based on them already being fairly defendable and being lots of hardscape, good defensible space, non-combustible roofs. These firefighters, they know what they can, potentially try to defend and what they can't. And so they're already picking winners. They're picking houses that are suitable for them to defend.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole premise behind defensible space. You want to make it safe for them to be there so they can do the job and save the house. And that works in many events, smaller events, where the resources are available. But this approach is not going to yield the loss reduction we want when we have very large events and multiple tens or even 100 events going on at the same time. We just cannot, there aren't enough people, first responders, to save every structure. So that we need to flip this on its head. Homes need to stand alone.
Right, exactly. Okay, Eric, do you want to start the chat? Select some people, some questions?
Sure. So Casey pointed out kindly, suggested that there's some good stuff in the chat, and there's a way to save the chat by pressing the little dots in the chat box. So if you're interested in that, that might be a good thing, because there's a couple of good discussions that went on there. But related to questions to this, Alex, I'll start with this one asked by Karen. Is the structures in the lab tests appear to be simple exterior homes and sheds. In the real world, homeowners may have many flammable items within the home itself, and these items have a large fuel load and agglomeration. So I'm assuming that the tests are on the conservative side, and in the real world, the heat produced would be much greater. So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we do the structure separation experiments, so the structure separation experiments, the work is done in 3 phases. We're currently in phase 1, which is shed to house. Phase 2 is auxiliary dwelling unit to house, and ADU to house. And phase 3 is primary residence to primary residence with an asterisk. There are some challenges experimentally with what can be done. And also we're going to be looking at RVs and cars to house, because that's a very important issue that we need to deal with. So we are mindful to be conservative in terms of the fuel loading of the source. We want to err, and by conservative, I mean, we want the fuel source to be on the upper bound of reasonable heat release rates for the source. So we put a lot of fuel in our sheds. The sheds are made, we test sheds, we do experiments with different construction materials, steel sheds, wood sheds, and composite plastic sheds, different sizes, different with high fuel load, with wind and without wind. to understand the spacing. The wall is typically Chapter 7A compliant. So the wall, I shouldn't say the wall, the structure, the target structure is Chapter 7A compliant. The wall, the window, the eaves, the roof, all of that. We are not interested at this point for phases 1 and 2. We're not looking at the energy release of the structure of the target once it catches. We want to know how far apart they need to be to prevent the target from catching. The energy release of the source term will be assessed, at least in a preliminary way, because there's so many variables in phase 3. So for phase 2, we're going to be looking at the energy release from auxiliary dwelling units, and there the fuel contents of the ADU. We are actually in the process of finalizing the design of our ADUs for our phase 2 work, where we put the chairs and the beds and all the stuff in the ADUs to get realistic worst case for fuel loading and therefore exposure.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Then there were 2 other questions sort of regarding fuel loading, 2 different examples, but maybe you can talk about them together. The first one is, what about the WUI or WUI adjacent homeowners who have generators and so therefore keep fuel on their properties? And then the second, with the push from California to have property owners add PV solar and backup batteries, how is the fuel load of that being addressed? Because we know how difficult it is to extinguish batteries. So those 2 might go hand in hand.
All right. So that is a great question on the generators, and we have not explicitly identified generators in HMM, but we have surrogates, I think, that can be used. We have cars, and that can, and also RVs, but specifically cars, I think, can be used to give us at least some sense. The fuel loading provided by batteries and solar and related issue with solar panels is definitely a challenge. For instance, at least in this phase of the work right now, phase 3 that we're planning, we are not going to be doing electrical vehicles. First, we're going to be dealing with gasoline. We may do a future phase with electric vehicles and energy storage issues within the house. The ability or the limited ability to extinguish such fires is a problem, but it's more a problem in the context of an individual fire, and it is much less a problem in the context of WUI fires, because first responders cannot deal with literally 15,000 homes, like we had in the camp going on over a short number of hours. But so I'm not saying it shouldn't be addressed. I think it has to be addressed, but for slightly different reasons. With the suppression part, the energy release part definitely, I think, is something that should be looked at in the future. We don't have it right now in the plans for SSC as part of the 3 phases of the ongoing effort, but certainly something that we can explore for future work. I want to mention briefly, because you mentioned solar, there is another component here which is a little bit problematic, and we don't quite have all the answers yet on that. There is the issue with the solar, I think, with respect to HMM, is really how to enable venting, the underside venting of the panels to occur while preventing fuel accumulation in the roof. So I think there is definitely some work that needs to be done there, because the last thing we want is, these pine needles getting stuck in areas that cannot be readily cleaned, and then, embers catching that stuff on fire, and then, the roof becomes much more compromised. So there will be plenty of opportunities, I think, going forward to look at the energy release. For now, we're going to be looking at gasoline-powered vehicles, NRVs for phase 3, and of the SSE work, and the cars, I think, can be used as a surrogate, at least at this point, for generators.
Okay. And then a question here about sheds. 2 questions. Are sheds not a hazard if the exterior is non-flammable and no windows or tempered windows are present? And related to that, what about plastic garden cabinets next to homes?
Okay, let me take the second one first. We have used in our shed test matrix, we used a number of sizes. The smallest one is what we call the closet, which is, I think, what you're referring to. So we did test those in wood, metal, and plastic. And the plastic closets are extremely hazardous. The report will be coming out, but the one, and I think it's okay for me to say at this point, do read the report when it comes out in the next 4 to 6 weeks. We'll make sure, Denise, you get it. And at some point, we can do a presentation later on. The one point I want to make about composite plastic sheds is that depending on the material, you could have melt and drip and pooling. So now you could be in a situation where not only you have a fire, but you have potentially a pool fire that can cause significant fire spread issues. So that is something that's going to be in the report, and you should look out for that. Is shed a problem if it is non-combustible? And that is in the report as well. All I will say to that is the shed by itself may not be a problem, but you cannot have a shed without having an opening. And in many cases in the field, we have seen people either intentionally or inadvertently keeping their shed doors open. Let's say, we've seen people store firewood in their shed and they want to keep the door open for ventilation. Yeah, having the door closed is definitely the way to go. But in real world situations, can we rely on that as an absolute? I don't think so. I think for metal sheds, we have to account for the energy release coming out from that open door as a realistic worst case scenario.
So that's everything that was from the chat. I don't know if there's Denise, if you want to call on people if you have time. I see a couple hands up.
Well, it's 11:20, but I did want to ask Alex. So Alex, have you or will you be doing any testing on Windows? So people, you make a good point about openings, and every structure obviously has openings. And so windows are considered openings and they're very vulnerable. And I was just wondering if you were going to be doing any testing on, extended exposure temperatures, when these windows are going to fail.
There's a great question. So a couple of things about Windows, but before I get to that, Denise, I want to make sure we don't forget. I want to make sure that you got the announcement for our NIST WUI days in July.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So all the information that I mentioned that's going to be coming out between now and July on fences and sheds, all of that stuff will be presented then. So we can, that'd be a good way to get, access to that information directly.
I just posted it. I just posted it on the chat.
Great. So let's talk about windows. I think with windows, we have two components. We have the actual panes, whether it's 1, 2, or 3, the construction of the panes, and then the assembly. And and when I say assembly, it's really two parts: is the frame and how the frame is connected to the building, because depending, there could be vulnerabilities and gaps that can cause problems. So let's take it one at a time. The window panes, tempered adds significant value. We know that this has been demonstrated, and I should say that in the experiments that we have done to date, the first series of experiments we did in the indoor experiments, the picture that I showed in the presentation of the shed catching the eaves of the house on fire, that window there was not tempered. In the outdoor series we did, we went with tempered. That was a regular hung window. So tempered adds value. There is one, double pane with both tempered definitely adds more value than single pane. The exact threshold really depends on exposures. To us, if you're only going to do double pane with single tempered, do the exterior tempered. I think, but we don't want not tempered. I think that's definitely, we can say that with confidence, where you're going to expect exposures, right? So again, directional hardening if you don't have enough money to do everything. The second part is the frame. There is, we have identified an issue, and we're going to be working on that. It's not complete, it's not resolved. There are certain construction materials that when heated can deform, and there are certain configurations, I shouldn't say configurations, designs where the paints, even tempered paints, will fall off the frame, and land on the ground intact, but open up the building to problems. So going forward, we want to build, we want to make sure we have a good package, that the window panes are good and the whole frame and how it is installed in the assembly is providing the necessary protection for the expected exposures. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's great. That's and I think a lot of people need to understand that as well when they're selecting their windows or replacing their windows. Okay, we have a couple of hands up, and then we'll wrap it up. So first we'll go to Bob Turcott, and then we'll go to Joanne.
Thank you. Thanks for the excellent presentation and the really great work. I was wondering if you could easily go to your slide 43, which I found particularly profound. I had a couple comments and a question. What struck me about this is, I mean, you've been saying it throughout your presentation and throughout the technical note, but structure separation is so fundamental to thinking about how to mitigate risk. And I think this slide makes it really clear. I was really struck by the fact that hardening against direct flame impingement and radiant heat is not recommended for the shortest distance. And that struck me as, reflective of sort of the care and integrity with which, the authors produced this, that they would have the honesty to not recommend hardening against flame impingement for that shortest distance, that the resources are better spent elsewhere, for example, installing sprinklering in the auxiliary structure, excuse me. So that's my interpretation. Please correct me if I'm off there. And my question is, I understand that the purpose of this technical note is to address existing structures, but as you know, there's a big push for development, and in our community, there's a big push for dense development. And it seems to me that the implication of first pursuing the 3 Rs before hardening and the implication of hardening against flame impingement not being recommended for the shortest distance. It seems that to me that the implication of that is that that we really shouldn't put structures next to each other less than 25 feet in general as we're envisioning new development, and in particular in situations where a fire in that development would disproportionately put surrounding areas at risk due to topography or something like that. So I was wondering, yeah, if you would correct my thinking where it's wrong there. Thank you.
Bob, you are right on. You know, I'll tell you a couple of things. You know, I want to take a step back from look at HMM from 30,000 feet. I'll tell you at the personal level, we are very pleased that this is, first of all, a partnership with CAL FIRE and IBHS, because this not only leveraged all the technical knowledge, but also enabled both institutions to acknowledge some of the points highlighted in the report, even if they go beyond their current recommendations, whether they are, you know, insurance guidance or Chapter 7A code standards at the state level. So I think, first of all, having that team look at this collectively and make some of those statements, I think adds significant value. The point of high density, you know, when I first laid this out, this spatial concept for HMM, and then we presented it to the team, and everybody came on board. You know, it was like, you know, it popped. People really got it very quickly, and to me, you know, and I want to stress that this is non-regulatory, so it's not up to us to tell you, you know, do this, do that. You know, we give you the science, you guys decide. But you know, there is no free lunch, right? So if we want to do very high density and we don't want the communities to essentially be disposable, we have to have very strict, very strict requirements. So I know that for existing communities, it's a very hard sell. It's a lot of lifting, because heavy lifting, because people bought in, they have become accustomed to a certain lifestyle. They want to have their, you know, little shed on their deck to put their grill stuff, and they want to have their play set, and they want to have their, you know, pick whatever combustible you want. I'm not particularly, you know, picking one or another, but let's also add, just for discussion purposes, all their combustible privacy fences. So to go in and say, hey, you know, we need to now clean this up is going to take a lot of education. But I think that using Tubbs Fire and Coffee Park as a backdrop for the discussion can really add a lot of value to inform and educate. So we are stuck with what we have already zoned and built. Going forward, I think if, you know, looking at it again from a non-regulatory perspective, if someone told me, hey, I want to build a high density community, and I was the AHJ, I would say, hey, you know, this is how it needs to be laid out with very strict rules. I mean, let me give you an example. You can build this community, this virtual community that's HMM compliant, and you have a deviation. You have a homeowner that brings and parks their RV on their lot for 2 days when they're not supposed to. Well, if a fire occurs during those 2 days and everything else in the community is good, that RV may end up burning the entire community down. That's just how sensitive those high density communities are. We literally cannot stop it. I mean, we see it over and over across the nation. So we can do that, but we have to ensure that every home does not catch. Not 80%, not 60%, not 97%. Every home does not catch, which is a high bar. Alternatively, we space things apart, we do some directional hardening, still be mindful about the fuels. It's not like in this situation, in this configuration, you can have everything you want. You cannot park your RV here. You cannot have a big shed here and, combustible fences all the way around, because again, it'll take off. But at least this can be managed more easily, because there will be some things that people will be able to have under certain situations. And here we will add value with the directional hardening. And there are some tweaks. We say hardening here, but if we were to go forward and look at and this was done for existing communities, but if we were to go forward, I would like to see very hard guidance for these sides where most of the vulnerabilities are removed. Well, if we're going to be in this, I'm calling it the sweet spot, but in this range, then let's not have windows on the sides. Get rid of that vulnerability. Let's not even have vents on that side. Let's, if there are eaves, let's go ahead and enclose the eaves. Let's try and remove and reduce those ignition potentials on those sides, and then move them to other sides of the building that are much more easy to manage in terms of the exposures. Bob, does that make sense to you?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Joanne, did you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, that would be great. So I guess my first comment is hopefully this presentation is going to be given to the state of California. There's a big planning meeting that happens every year where each jurisdiction sends their usually a couple of planners and their planning director. Hopefully they're provided this presentation. I think that would be super helpful for them, along with it being shown to jurisdictions planning and architectural view boards, so they understand when they're looking at projects, they should be mindful of saying, oh, add more screening for the neighbors. Oh, can you put this kind of fence here? So it gives them a better understanding of why things should be designed the way they are. But this should also be given to the legislature, so they stop making it impossible for jurisdictions. I came from a jurisdiction, for them to be, from them being able to mitigate what happens in that scenario with everything being so close together. Because unfortunately, there are so many state laws being put into effect right now without the thought of fuel and spacing. No regard to that at all. So it makes it very hard for jurisdictions to do their job.
Joanne, let me say the following. We are very happy to share it with you, and we're very happy to share this at large. The purpose of our WUI days is to really disseminate the the material, the information we're generating to the community at large in an effective way. Having said that, we are mindful, and we don't, we will gladly present to decision makers. I mentioned, our structure separation distance work, for instance. We presented to Chief Porter and the leadership of CAL FIRE. The campfire, we presented not only to him, but also to the Board of Forestry. So if there are parties of interest at the state level that want to hear it, certainly please direct them our way, and we will engage. So we cannot do this at a small individual community because of our limited resources. There are only so many presentations we can give because we have so much material that's coming out. But at the like we're doing with you, at the Fire Safe Council level, at the county level, at the state level, we are more than happy to make us, to engage and do presentations and share the material. And I agree with you. I think that we feel this is not only important, but important and different enough where people that make decisions on zoning and planning at high levels could potentially see value. Absolutely.
All right, Alex, well, thank you so much. I mean, I think we all agree, everyone on this call, that the housing density requirements that are being pushed by the state are really the cart before the horse, because we don't have our home hardening and our codes in order yet to protect all those new houses that they want all these communities to build. So it's literally creating more of a problem. And unfortunately, these are people's lives at stake. People live in these structures. So, yeah.
And Denise, you're absolutely right there. And we didn't dwell on this. And this is going to come out at our Camp 4 report with respect to Paradise and the campfire. There's definitely a significant life safety issue here.
Yes.
But high density is a very different animal.
Yes.
And needs to be treated in a very different way than moderate and low density. And it's not that we cannot build them. We can build them, but if we want them to survive, then the bar has to be set very, very high.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
That's just here. I mean, that's science. That's that's how fire behaves. And so yeah, we'll be glad to share this if any members of the group have contacts and they want to make connections with folks in California, whether it's at the state level, legislature, or whatever. And we'll be happy to share this if people are interested. Absolutely.
Okay. And then we would like in the future to hear your report, the phase 2 report on ADUs and sheds. I think that will, you're kind of creating a series here of dissecting
Yes.
this problem. So please keep us notified about when that report is completed.
Yeah, we will make sure you get a link to the press release and the report, the first report of the sheds, which should be coming out in 4 to 6 weeks, and then the second report of the sheds, which should be coming out later in the summer. I don't know. I suspect we will not have the second report before the NIST WUI days in July, but it'll probably come out, in late summer. So we'll keep you informed, and all the material that has been presented at the camp, HMM, the fences that's coming out, the first shed reports, and a number of other reports, including I think our wood piles report. All of that will be presented at the next WUI days. So we'll make sure that you get all the links as they come out, and continue our collaboration. And we look forward to more discussions with all of you.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex, and thank you for all your great work at NIST. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.